Blake Lively's attorney, Mary L. Jaworski, has officially exited the law firm she had been affiliated with since at least 2023 and has joined a different firm. As a result of the move, she has withdrawn from a separate legal matter she was co-leading with Michael Gutaudel, specifically the defamation case where Drake is suing Kendrick Lamar and UMG. As of today, Jaworski remains active on Lively's legal team, though the recent developments mark a shift. Her departure is part of a broader exodus, with 7 prominent partners exiting Willkie Farr and Gallagher. After the firm entered into a controversial settlement with Donald Trump, this came after issued executive orders targeting legal firms involved in investigations against him or those opposing his policies. Orders he issued to limit such firms' business dealings with the federal government. Some firms ultimately settled, agreeing to terms that included large payouts to Trump, Willkie Farr, and Gallagher, where one partner is Doug Emhoff, husband to Kamala Harris, committed $100 million in complimentary legal services toward Trump-approved initiatives and agreed not to participate in what was termed unlawful diversity-related employment efforts, according to a Reuters report. When this deal was finalized, internal communication acknowledged staff concerns. "We understand this decision is disappointing to many of you, and some of you may have hoped we took a different path. Leadership did not make this decision lightly. The rationale provided was that the firm might not survive financially without settling. Since then, several legal firms have filed suit against these executive orders, and at least 4 federal judges have already declared them unconstitutional." Jaworski was among those who objected to the settlement terms, prompting her to leave and align with a group of attorneys from another top-tier firm, Paul, Weiss, Rifkind, Wharton, and Garrison. That firm played a major role in the Manhattan prosecution of Trump involving financial crimes. 4 of their partners broke off in May to start a new firm, and Jaworski has now joined them. These 7 total high-profile exits include figures tied to Gaudel's own firm. He's part of Willkie's executive leadership. They reportedly left in protest over the firm's $100 million commitment to Trump. To be clear, this isn't meant as political commentary, just a recap of what's been unfolding behind the scenes. For now, Jaworski is still involved in the Lively case, though that may change. With lawyers from 3 separate firms now on record representing Lively, her legal representation is increasingly spread out. The boutique firm Jaworski has joined was just established in May, and she's coming on board as a partner. Rumors have swirled online suggesting she quit the case, but it appears her departure was more about dissatisfaction with her firm's actions than anything. Related to Lively's litigation, Jaworski didn't respond to requests for comment, but Gaudetal did speak to Reuters, expressing hope they could still work together. She's played a significant role alongside him for years, especially in handling major defamation cases. So her departure clearly means something. With her background as a journalist before entering law, it's unclear how involved she remained in the matter moving forward. But if her exit from Willkie is any indicator, the firm may have leaned on her heavily. Just look at the letter they submitted yesterday, trying to argue jurisdiction. It raises serious questions. Gutaudel filed a 2-page statement to prove that Jed Wallace had actionable ties to New York, but every legal expert I've spoken to said the logic doesn't hold up. Still, Judge Lyman asked them to clarify any specific actions within the alleged conspiracy that connect Wallace to New York jurisdictionally. Wallace, in his own declaration, said he believed he was working for Wayfair and Tagboth, based in California, and that most of his communications were with Melissa Nathan, a California resident. He says he's never operated in New York, and that Lively can't point to anything he did that was directed at that jurisdiction. So now her legal team is trying to construct an overly stretched theory just to meet jurisdictional requirements. According to them, the amended complaint includes allegations that multiple co-conspirators carried out explicit acts tied to the conspiracy while physically present in New York. Their example? That Wayfair, Belden, and Heath were allegedly told by Lively, in person, while in New York, about her concerns, which later led to the alleged retaliation. But here's the catch. Jed Wallace wasn't even part of the team during that time. He wasn't involved at all in those conversations. So, that argument is bound to fall flat. So now they're trying to argue that Melissa Nathan lived and did business in New York for part of the time in question. But that still doesn't connect Jed Wallace to anything. They're also claiming that Steve Surowitz announced some kind of conspiracy to ruin Blake, Lively, and her family during the film's premiere in New York. But Jed wasn't hired until August 8th or 9th. And the New York premiere happened on August 6th. Everything she's trying to use to tie Jed to this situation occurred before he was even brought on board. The amended complaint also accuses Nathan of furthering the alleged scheme by contacting journalists, media outlets, and content creators in New York, including one journalist reportedly at the New York Times, who's also said to be Nathan's sister. Because Nathan lived in New York during that period, they're claiming she did this work from there. Every one of those actions would qualify as an overt act committed while physically in New York. But this line of reasoning isn't going to hold up. Even if those things happened, Blake hasn't outlined anything specific that actually caused her harm. And none of it connects directly back to Jed. All of this is tied to Nathan, not Wallace, and her team is trying to pin New York-based jurisdiction on Wallace based on his supposed connection to people like Nathan, but that's a reach. They even try to argue that because Wallace had worked with Nathan in the past in a totally unrelated project hand, because Nathan might have had a place in New York, that somehow makes Wallace linked to the state. That argument doesn't even make logical sense. They're essentially saying that since Wallace once knew Nathan, and Nathan spent time in New York, that must link Wallace to actions taken in New York, even if he wasn't involved yet. They're trying to build a case where simply knowing someone who was later involved equates to jurisdiction. It's a stretch like prosecuting someone for something that happened before they even knew you existed. According to their reasoning, Jed knew Nathan. Nathan sometimes stays in New York. Surowitz made a comment in New York and Baldoni heard about the complaints in New York. Therefore, Wallace must be tied to New York. That's what they're pitching. They go so far as to say Wallace should have known Nathan lived in New York, but in his own declaration, he says he always understood Nathan and the companies he worked with, Tag and Wayfair, to be based in California. He genuinely believed he was working exclusively with California-based operations. They claim that under broad legal interpretations of agency law, Nathan and Tag's actions in New York should be attributed to Wallace if he was aware that their actions would have an impact in New York. But even then, the standard requires that the in-state actors were operating at the direction, control, or for the benefit of the out-of-state defendant. Wallace wasn't calling the shots. Undermines their whole argument. Lively's team also says the defendants knew their collaborators included New York-based individuals who were allegedly retaliating against her and trying to harm her public image, and that Wallace's company was paid to assist in that. But the third part of their argument relies on claiming that Wallace was aware that others were committing wrongful acts in New York, even if he wasn't involved directly. There's no allegation that he ordered or directed anything, just that he allegedly knew it was happening. It's incredibly weak. They're trying to use conspiracy jurisdiction as a workaround to bypass the state's long-arm statute, which normally requires direct individual contact with the state. Their position is that Wallace didn't dispute whether the other defendants had sufficient contacts with New York, and that because of that, all their actions should apply to Wallace too. They argue that by allegedly joining the conspiracy, he was aware acts would be carried out in New York on his behalf. But here's the most revealing part. They're clearly nervous it won't be enough. They've told the judge that if their current personal jurisdiction argument over Wallace doesn't work, they're ready to revise the complaint later once they've gathered more information and discovery, possibly even from Wallace himself. They're already anticipating that this claim might get thrown out, and they're laying the groundwork to try again with updated allegations. That admission is huge. It shows just how shaky their jurisdiction argument really is. So now, the whole case against Wallace feels scattered and disorganized. There are way too many threads being pulled in different directions, and most of them don't lead anywhere solid. There are a lot of moving parts to break it down. At this point, Blake is accusing Wallace of aiding and abetting harassment and retaliation. He plays a key role in that allegation, meaning she claims he participated in targeted discrimination against her and helped coordinate an astroturfing effort to undermine her reputation. If Wallace is removed from the case, This entire accusation weakens significantly because he's no longer involved, and as a result, the scope of discovery would shrink too. And if she still wants to pursue that claim, she'll have to take it to Texas, where Wallace is actually suing her. Another charge that could fall apart is the false light invasion of privacy. This stems from her claims that Wallace and Street, with others, exposed private information about her marketing tactics, personal values, and family life in ways that misrepresented her. But this entire case really boils down to her frustration with how people responded to her film promotion. She didn't appreciate the criticism she received. She's upset that people online reposted clips of her making remarks that many felt were dismissive, whether toward fans, journalists, or just during interviews. None of that, however, actually exposes personal matters, moral failings, or private family details. I've seen no reporting or coverage that even mentions her family or values. This accusation is already on shaky ground. To believe it, you'd have to assume the internet didn't do what the internet always does: dig up footage and compile posts to paint someone in a bad light. That's exactly what happens every time someone is publicly canceled. If Wallace is removed from that claim, Blake loses her main argument that this behavior violated her privacy in a meaningful, malicious way. And then we have the conspiracy allegation. If Wallace gets tossed, she loses the individual she says planted those viral videos and negative posts with an orchestrated online force. Her civil conspiracy argument hinges on the idea that this social media backlash was fake, paid for, and not authentic, that it was engineered by bots, overseas contractors, or Wayfair-paid influencers. Without Wallace, proving that theory becomes a serious uphill battle. And if she loses him as a defendant, her whole legal strategy may have to pivot. That brings us to the question, why is she suddenly turning her attention to content creators? Here's what I suspect. Blake likely realizes there was no hidden digital assault campaign. She probably knows that Wallace wasn't behind some coordinated attack. My guess is that she and her legal team are preparing for the likelihood that Wallace gets dismissed from the case and that she needs a backup plan. That's where the new angle comes in. The idea that content creators like Candace Owens, Perez Hilton, and Andy were allegedly paid by someone like Brian Friedman or his associates to post unflattering content about her. Wayfair. Since she can't prove Wallace ran a ghost campaign, this new theory steps in. Even in her letter to the court, she openly acknowledges she lacks evidence tying Wallace to any activity in New York. Her strongest point is that Melissa Nathan may have been in New York during some of their correspondence. That's hardly convincing. What really stands out to me is how, despite Brian Friedman's high-profile legal reputation, there seemed to be serious missteps in their legal strategy. For one, they didn't file a motion to dismiss Blake's complaint. Friedman has filed dismissals in other big cases, like when Vin Diesel was accused of harassment by a former employee and did so by pointing out problems with how the CRD complaint was filed, and using the argument that it was time-barred. Blake, on the other hand, had her harassment claims blocked by federal limitations. Under federal law, you only have 1 year from the incident to sue, and she missed that deadline. That alone should have disqualified some of her claims. Also, questionable moves in how she filed her CRD complaint, including whether she even had standing to pursue certain claims. It seems like she brought a weak case to court and, instead of pushing back with dismissal filings, her opponents let it proceed. That's a major oversight. They should have challenged the lack of an EEOC right to sue letter. Should have questioned the CRD's procedural defects. And they should have absolutely raised the fact that her harassment claims were time-barred. Even retaliation claims lose strength if they occur too long after the triggering event. Retaliation. And part of the reason things are likely to unravel for her legally is that in her own filing, she acknowledges that once she raised her concerns, they were addressed and filming proceeded smoothly, with no additional incidents. After she agreed to the 17-point resolution, so essentially she's suing over something she previously confirmed had been settled, which undercuts her entire argument. Then she pivots and alleges that months after everything was resolved in Airlie, a year later, they suddenly retaliated. But that's not how retaliation works under the law. What I see here is a potential opening, because if the judge decides, sure, I'll give you permission to amend, then Blake will have to revise the entire complaint. Not just against Wallace, but against all of the parties involved. Means everyone Wayfair, Justin, Sarewitz, Nathan, and Abel gets the opportunity to file new motions to dismiss. So the bigger picture here is that her whole legal case is teetering on the edge, and both she and her team seem aware of that. Which brings us to why they're now pivoting toward going after content creators, my take. It's because they realize their claim against Jed is built on very shaky ground. It basically admit as much in their letter to the judge. They'll have no tangible link tying Jed to New York, nor can they point to any specific action he took that substantiates any of her allegations, nothing that would support false light, aiding or abetting, or retaliation. There's no real evidence at this point connecting him to the alleged wrongdoing. So what Gotta Tell is doing now seems more like throwing darts in the dark. Honestly, I'd love to see the judge approve a motion to dismiss and grant her the option to refile, because that would open the door for Wayfair and the others to finally file their own motions to dismiss. And at that point, her failure to go through the EEOC process will be even more glaring. She had 30 days to file with the EEOC. She didn't. That alone is enough to strike out a big portion of her claims due to timing issues. They'll have legitimate legal grounds to challenge every single allegation and potentially get the entire case thrown out. From my perspective, her entire lawsuit looks increasingly weak. Of course, we'll have to wait and see how things play out. But if Jed is dismissed, I think the structure collapses. If she's forced to amend, it simply creates an opportunity for everyone else to step in and challenge her again, this time with stronger footing. I've heard people say Justin needs to be publicly vindicated, but really he doesn't. A dismissal is still a legal victory. If the court finds her claims insufficient, that's what matters. Even though it's frustrating that Justin's lawsuit was tossed, we don't know yet if they'll appeal, but we can hope. Still, Blake's lawsuit never should have gotten this far. It was weak from the beginning, and no, Justin doesn't need to go to trial to prove anything. Public opinion has already shifted, and people have made up their minds he's not guilty. So what do you think?